Good morning, gardeners, and welcome to Thursday, June 8th. My name is Catherine, and I created a show called Good Morning Gardeners, even though I can't grow green things, because I am referring to gardening metaphorically. We are planting the seeds for a better day. We're starting our day by getting in the right mindset to cultivate a better life for ourselves, better communities, and a better world. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you would like to add Good Morning Gardeners to your morning routine. I do my best to wake you up with positive and mentally stimulating ideas, but sometimes I miss things. If you have something to add to the ideas I discuss, please chime in the comment section below. Today is World Oceans Day. The ocean covers over 70% of the globe and produces at least 50% of the planet's oxygen. It is home to most of the Earth's biodiversity, and it is the main source of protein for more than 1 billion people around the world. The ocean plays a big role in the global economy, with an estimated 40 million people being employed by ocean-based industries by the year 2030. And now the ocean is in need of support. With 90% of big fish populations depleted and 50% of coral reefs destroyed, we are taking more from the ocean than can be replenished. We need to work together to create a new balance with the ocean that no longer depletes its bounty, but instead restores its vibrancy and brings it new life. You can learn more about this international observance by visiting unworldoceansday.org, which I have linked in the description of this video. So, this morning, what I'm going to talk to you about, because I've been thinking about it, is sort of the overlap and intersection between fear and anxiety, inhibition, being reserved, and being introverted. Now, I have been labeled unfairly as shy for my entire life, and I have loathed this label because, number one, it sounds limiting. Somebody who is shy, not only are they introverted, but they are petrified of speaking to people, and they won't speak up when they have something to say. Okay, maybe it's not completely unfair that I have been labeled as shy, but I have always resented it, and it has been one of my missions since I was a young child not to be shy. So I do think that there is a difference between being shy and being introverted. Being introverted simply means that you don't gain your energy, you don't get more energy from being around people, you get more energy from being alone. But being shy, it implies something inhibiting, something paralyzing, something that causes you to be ineffective because you can't speak up. And so I have learned to embrace introversion, but I continue to fight against being shy. And this goes hand in hand with fighting against being afraid or having anxiety. And most recently, being inhibited. But I think that there are, the way that these topics are often talked about is, not necessarily the most helpful. And, it can be quite interesting. So I'm going to jump in and read to you the source of what got me thinking about this in the first place. As I mentioned previously, I'm currently reading through No BS Wealth Attraction in the New Economy by Dan Kennedy. And I do not recommend this book. I am on page 43 out of roughly 200, so I can already tell you I don't love it, but of course I'm still going to finish it. It might be redeemed. It might be redeemed, but so far I don't recommend it. But we are just going to read this short section that kind of got my gears turning on this topic. Okay. He writes, "Everyone who is anyone of achievement and wisdom counsels us against fear. Jesus counseled us against fear. Pope John Paul II counseled us against fear. The pioneer in self-improvement, Earl Nightingale, pointed out that most of the things we worry endlessly about never occur except in our own negative imaginations. Napoleon Hill wrote in the classic Laws of Success about the ghosts of fear. The president wrote speeches for whom he goaded America out of the Depression and famously said, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." Every client I've ever had who made a fear-based business decision has later regretted it. Every time we say no to fear, we win. It's important to understand that fear is learned. We are born with fears of falling, fear of loud unknown noises, and a fear of snakes. Otherwise, God sends us here completely free of fear. We learn our fears from other humans. We are conditioned to be fearful by what we hear and observe as children, by the influences of fearful adults we associate with. The irrational nature of most fears is well illustrated by the fact that more people fear public speaking than fear debilitating illness or death. So even though, like I said, I don't really recommend this book because I think there are other books maybe that talk about, wealth attraction with a better tone and voice, I think that is good advice. What he says about fear, it pretty much checks out. But it really reminded me of this book. It was very reminiscent of what Jen Sincero, who wrote You Are a Badass, says about fear. So let's quickly dive into this book and revisit what Jen has to say about fear. She says, "We've made being in fear a habit. We are pumped full of it as children, like sugar. Then, as we grow, we continue to take in the bad news on TV and the horror in the papers and the violence in books and films and video games and all this junk that fills us to the brim with fear about our world. We're taught to play it safe and not take risks, and to caution everyone around us to follow suit. And it's become such an accepted part of our social conditioning that we don't even realize we're doing it. For example, what would your immediate response be to someone you really loved and cared deeply for if they said, whilst sputtering with excitement, any of the following things to you? I am taking out a gigantic loan to build my dream business. I am going to travel around the world for a year by myself. I'm quitting my secure full-time job to become an actor. I met the most incredible person last week and I'm totally in love and we are getting married. I'm going skydiving." For the most part, when we watch someone take a leap of faith, our first reaction is to scream, "Look out!" We have not only made a habit of smearing our fear and worry and doubt all over each other, but we pat ourselves on the backs for it because we believe it shows how much we care. That is something worth being scared of, if you ask me. There's something called the crab effect. If you put a bunch of crabs in a bowl, while they're in there crawling all over each other, if one of them tries to climb out, the rest of them will try to pull him back down instead of trying to push him out. No wonder they're called crabs. Imagine how different our world would be if we were less crab-like, if we were not only taught to really truly believe in miracles. Yes, I realize how dorky that sounds, but were rewarded and supported instead of cautioned and screamed at for taking huge leaps into the unknown. We give a lot of lip service to the idea that anything is possible, and we all grow up with posters of kittens and baby seals on our walls that say follow your dreams on them. But should you actually do something radical, all the flashing lights and sirens go off. Know what I'm saying? Fear lives in the future. The fear of being afraid is real. The feeling of being afraid is real, but the fear itself is all made up because it hasn't even happened yet. Death, going bankrupt, breaking a leg, forgetting our lines, getting yelled at for being late, getting rejected, etc. Most of the time we have no guarantee that what we fear is even going to happen, and that if it does, it's going to be scary. Take death, for example. For all we know, we leave our bodies and melt into a state of pure love and light and sparkly things and unicorns and bunnies, eternal orgasmic giddiness. We can be as sure of that as we can about anything else in the future, so why create all the drama? All it takes to turn the fear factor around is learning to be comfortable in, instead of terrified of, the unknown. And this is done through faith. It basically comes down to how you choose to go through life. Is your fear greater than your faith in the unknown and yourself? Or is your faith in the unknown and yourself greater than your fear? While you're making your choice, here's a mouthful from good old Helen Keller. Life is either a daring adventure or nothing. To keep our faces toward change and behave like free spirits in the presence of fate is strength undefeatable. There's that incredible moment when you decide, screw it, I'm going for it, and suddenly the thrill overtakes the fear. And then you're flying on the magic carpet, you're signing on the dotted line to buy the house, confronting your father, sliding the ring onto the finger, stepping onto the stage in front of thousands. I mean, talk about feeling alive. On the other side of your fear is your freedom. So I love this book and I do recommend it. And I agree with what was said in both of these books that, being overly afraid is definitely something to be afraid of, and that most of us have made being in fear or being afraid of certain things a habit. But the way these authors discuss this topic feels a little one-size-fits-all to me. And the example in No BS Wealth Attraction of children being afraid of loud noises reminded me of something I read a few years ago. My dog is moaning, sorry if you can hear that, in a book called Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking by Susan Cain. In the section I'm going to read today, Susan has just finished talking about her fear of public speaking and the intense social anxiety it makes her feel. She writes, I haven't completely overcome my anxiety, but over the years, I've discovered strategies can help anyone with stage fright who needs to speak in public. More about that in Chapter 5, but in the meantime, I have told you my tale of abject terror because it lies at the heart of some of my most urgent questions about introversion. On some deep level, my fear of public speaking seems connected to other aspects of my personality that I appreciate, especially my love of all things gentle and cerebral. This strikes me as a not uncommon constellation of traits. But are they truly connected? And if so, how? Are they the result of nurture, meaning the way I was raised? Both of my parents are soft-spoken, reflective types. My mother hates public speaking too. Or are they my nature, something deep in my genetic makeup? I've been puzzling over these questions for my entire adult life. Fortunately, so have researchers at Harvard, where scientists are probing the human brain in an attempt to discover the biological origins of human temperament. One such scientist is an 82-year-old man named Jerome Kagan, one of the great developmental psychologists of the 20th century. Kagan devoted his career to studying the emotional and cognitive development of children. In a series of groundbreaking longitudinal studies, he followed children from infancy through adolescence, documenting their physiologies and personalities along the way. Longitudinal studies like these are time-consuming, expensive, and therefore rare. But when they pay off as Kagan's did, they pay off big. For one of those studies, launched in 1989 and still ongoing, Professor Kagan and his team gathered 500 4-month-old infants in his laboratory for child development at Harvard, predicting they'd be able to tell, on the strength of a 45-minute evaluation, which babies were more likely to turn into introverts or extroverts. If you have seen a 4-month-old baby lately, this may seem an audacious claim, but Kagan had been studying temperament for a long time, and he had a theory. Kagan and his team exposed the 4-month-olds to carefully chosen set of new experiences. The children heard tape-recorded voices and balloons popping, saw colorful mobiles dancing before their eyes, and inhaled the scent of alcohol on cotton swabs. They had wildly varying reactions to the new stimuli. About 20% cried lustily and pumped their arms and legs. Kagan called this group high reactive. About 40% stayed quiet and placid, moving their arms or legs occasionally, but without all the dramatic limb pumping. This group Kagan called low reactive. The remaining 40% fell between these two extremes. In a startlingly counterintuitive hypothesis, Kagan predicted that it was the infants in the high reactive group, the lusty arm pumpers, who were most likely to grow into quiet teenagers. When they were 2, 4, 7, and 11 years old, many of the children returned to Kagan's lab for follow-up testing of their reactions to new people and events. At the age of 2, the children met a lady wearing a gas mask and a lab coat, a man dressed in a clown costume, and a radio-controlled robot. At 7, they were asked to play with kids they had never met before. At 11, an unfamiliar adult interviewed them about their personal lives. Kagan's team observed how the children reacted to these strange situations, noting their body language and recording how often and spontaneously they laughed, talked, and smiled. They also interviewed the kids and their parents about what the children were like outside the laboratory. Did they prefer 1 or 2 close friends to a merry band? Did they like visiting new places? Were they risk-takers or were they more cautious? Did they consider themselves shy or bold? Many of the children turned out exactly as Kagan had expected. The high-reactive infants, the 20% who'd hollered at the mobiles bobbing above their heads, were more likely to have developed serious, careful personalities. The low-reactive infants, the quiet ones, were more likely to have become relaxed and confident types. High and low reactivity tended to correspond, in other words, to introversion and extroversion. So yes, most of us are born with a fear of unknown loud noises, but apparently this fear affects 20% of us much more than others. And apparently another 20% don't really react much at all. And it would seem that the high reactive 20% go on to become generally more inhibited, or you could say more fearful, adolescents and then adults. So at the risk of going too long on today's episode, I want to jump very quickly into one more book, Psycho-Cybernetics by Maxwell Maltz, to read what he has to say about inhibition. He says, everyone has a personality locked up within him. Every human being has the mysterious something we call personality. When we say that a person has a good personality, what we really mean is that he has freed and released the creative potential within him and is able to express his real self. Poor personality and inhibited personality are one and the same. The person with a poor personality does not express the creative self within. He has restrained it, handcuffed it, locked it up, and thrown away the key. The word inhibit literally means to stop, prevent, prohibit, restrain. The inhibited personality has imposed a restraint upon the expression of the real self. For one reason or another, he is afraid to express himself, afraid to be himself, and has locked up his real self within an inner prison. So Maxwell Maltz then goes on to explain that this inhibition results from what he calls excessive negative feedback, which basically means negative responses that we get from the people with whom we interact. He says, where negative feedback is excessive, or where our own mechanism is too sensitive to negative feedback, the result is not modification of response, but total inhibition of response. Inhibition and excessive negative feedback are one and the same. When we overreact to negative feedback or criticism, we are likely to conclude that not only is our present course slightly off beam or wrong, but that it is wrong for us to even want to go forward. So for our feel-good moment today, I want to go back into what I call the quiet book. I love the scientific approach this book takes to personalities, and I personally feel that learning about human psychology can be even more helpful than uplifting advice. So here, once again, we are talking about the study that was done on babies who were tracked throughout their childhoods and into adolescence. In addition to observing the children's behaviors in strange situations, Kagan's team measured their heart rates, blood pressure, finger temperature, and other properties of the nervous system. Kagan chose these measures because they're believed to be controlled by a potent organ inside the brain called the amygdala. The amygdala is located deep in the limbic system, an ancient brain network found even in primitive animals like mice and rats. This network, sometimes called the emotional brain, underlies many of the basic instincts we share with these animals, such as appetite, sex drive, and fear. The amygdala serves as the brain's emotional switchboard, receiving information from the senses and then signaling the rest of the brain and the nervous system how to respond. One of its functions is to instantly detect new or threatening things in the environment, from an airborne frisbee to a hissing serpent, and send rapid-fire signals through the body that trigger the fight or flight response. When the frisbee looks like it's headed straight for your nose, it's your amygdala that tells you to duck. When the rattlesnake prepares to bite, it's the amygdala that makes sure you run. Kagan hypothesized that infants born with an especially excitable amygdala would wiggle and howl when shown unfamiliar objects, and grow up to be children who were more likely to feel vigilant when meeting new people. And this is just what he found. In other words, the 4-month-olds who thrashed their arms like punk rockers did so not because they were extroverts in the making, but because their little bodies reacted strongly. They were high reactive to new sights, sounds, and smells. The quiet infants were silent not because they were future introverts, just the opposite, but because they had the nervous systems that were unmoved by novelty. The more reactive a child's amygdala, the higher his heart rate is likely to be, the more widely dilated his eyes, the tighter his vocal cords, the more cortisol, or stress hormone, in his saliva, the more jangled he's likely to feel when he confronts something new and stimulating. As high reactive infants grow up, they continue to confront the unknown in many different contexts, from visiting an amusement park for the first time to meeting new classmates on the first day of kindergarten. We tend to notice most a child's reaction to unfamiliar people. How does he behave on the first day of school? Does she seem uncertain at birthday parties full of kids she doesn't know? But what we are really observing is a child's sensitivity to novelty in general, not just to people. High and low reactivity are probably not the only biological routes to introversion and extroversion. There are plenty of introverts who do not have the sensitivity of classic high reactive, and a small percentage of high reactives grow up to be extroverts. Still, Kagan's decades-long series of discoveries mark a dramatic breakthrough in our understanding of these personality styles, including the value judgments we make. Extroverts are sometimes credited with being pro-social, meaning caring about others, and introverts disparaged as people who don't like people. But the reactions of the infants in Kagan's tests had nothing to do with people. These babies were shouting, or not shouting, over Q-tips. They were pumping their limbs, or staying calm, in response to popping balloons. The high-reactive babies were not misanthropes in the making. They were simply sensitive to their environments. So, for our focus moment today, after you have hopefully absorbed everything I threw at you today, I want you to take stock of your own level of inhibition or fear. It might be helpful to close your eyes and imagine yourself in the control center of your mind. Look at the gauge that shows your level of fear. On the left of this dial is 0%. On the right is 100%, with an area marked in red to depict the danger zone. If you are in the danger zone, you are too inhibited and your fears are holding you back. If your gauge is at or past 100%, you are likely paralyzed with anxiety. Now, it's easy for people to tell us to calm down, relax, or chill out. The reminder that fear is simply a learned habit seems to be fairly prevalent, and if that is helpful for you, I invite you to let that idea sink in this morning. But I personally haven't found this type of advice to be very helpful. What I have found helpful is to remember that my fear is only a response to my environment. It is the result of my brain processing feedback from my environment and translating it into a chemical reaction that I interpret as an emotion in an attempt to protect me. It doesn't mean that I am an inferior or incompetent person. It just means that I am sensitive to negative feedback. And if I start to feel paralyzed by this sensitivity, it's time for me to look at the situation from another perspective. If this is you this morning, I invite you to do the same. I hope you found this helpful, and I hope you have a wonderful day. I will speak with you again tomorrow.